you all so much for joining us here this month. It is Fair Housing Month. Fair housing, talking about different practices to be more equitable. And there's been a lot in the news that we're going to talk about. There's a lot of things, but I have two experts that I personally know really well. So I'm really excited about this month's panel, and I'm going to jump right in and have them both introduce themselves in just a moment. But we have Miss Tina McNeal-O'Brien. It's a lot of names. And I could put Queen in front of that. But Tina and I have been friends for a while. We've been colleagues. And Tina is a broker, as I was corrected, out in Detroit. And she's been in the real estate game for a long time. Both of our guests have been. And so Tina, why don't you tell us a little bit more about just, what chapter are you a member of? How long you've been in BNI, your real estate background? Why don't you share a little bit more with us?
Absolutely. I'm Tina McNeal-O'Brien, once again, broker of the McNeal-O'Brien team real estate here in the Detroit metro area. Have been in real estate as of May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. 24 years in real estate, cumulatively about 100 years worth of real estate knowledge. My mom has been in real estate almost 57 years across 3 states. So it's a family-owned and operated minority business, and love making sure people are achieving the American dream of home ownership.
Fantastic. I love it. I love it. I love it. All right. Up next, someone who shares similar dreams, I know of for sure. Jason, I think it's been like 10 years that we were first introduced, which seems like a lifetime ago. So Jason is here where I live in Boston, and he's a realtor. He's with KW. He's been just phenomenal. He's been a leader. I'll let him tell more, but he's been just amazing and just has become a really close friend. So Jason, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Claudia, and good to be on the panel with you, Tina. Yes, so Jason Highland, residential realtor with Keller Williams. Like Tina, I also own a team. We've actually recently lost 2 people, so we are now a 7-person team, and been practicing real estate since 2007. Started off as a solo agent, and that's actually when I met Claudia and joined our BNI Plus chapter. We were one of the first chapters, I think, in a handful of years to sort of like start up, and it was following the 08-09 market crash, which was a lot to do with real estate. But that chapter has since been built up to a little north of $3 million. And I've had the great experience of basically filling every role in the chapter. And then in 2017 started our team, which is O'Connor and Highland. And we are situated right in downtown Boston. Boston is super duper compact. So there's like 23 neighborhoods all within, a couple of square miles. It is not one of the larger sprawling style cities. I grew up in Baltimore. It's sort of the opposite of Baltimore in terms of like how wide and big Baltimore is. Boston's sort of real tight. But anyway, yeah, I've been doing this for a bit, and now getting a lot of joy out of building a team and sort of passing on the legacy to those that are interested in doing business the right way.
I love it. I love it. That's really, really great for what we're going to jump into. So everyone that knows that has come here before, we have a panel style. We ask several questions in different topics. And like I said, there's 2, I can't think of 2 people just more well-trained, knowledgeable to talk about some of these topics. So we're going to jump right in. And of course, speaking of, you both come from cities and live in cities that are, this is a very well-known topic. So gentrification, for those that don't know what gentrification is, I would love to hear in your words, what is gentrification? What are its impacts, and do you see it slowing down? I know I have my own thoughts on gentrification, but would love to start with you, Jason.
Yeah, sure. And I think I have an interesting take on this. So my long-term business partner, his name is John. John is a gay man that has lived in an area of Boston called the South End since the mid-1980s. And for those of you that don't know Boston, it is a beautiful sort of Victorian brick architecture. that, you know, the neighborhoods in the city have gone through sort of like many versions of itself. So interestingly enough, you know, when John had moved into the South End, it was an interesting choice for him. It was sort of not a lot of people were moving into the city at the time. So John was sort of part of that group that like jumped into it and restored an old Victorian house. So when I think of gentrification, interestingly enough, I sort of follow the path of like the gay man jumps into the neighborhood that's sort of been sort of depressed down, and then all of a sudden rehabs the house, and then like house by house, block by block, you see sort of the neighborhood restored. So in a lot of ways, that's actually how I see gentrification. Its impacts, you want me to keep going, Claudia, or do you want me to stop there?
Yeah, well, I want to pause you for a minute. So that's interesting because in the 90s, while I was in college, I did an internship, and I also worked at Tower Records. Shout out to Tower Records. And there was one in Newbury Street that everyone knows of if you've ever gone to school in Boston or anything else. And that summer, I lived in a brownstone in the South End. And I know what you're speaking of, right? It was less than stellar. It wasn't the ideal neighborhood that people wanted to live into, but you could see the sparks of something. And I think, you know, when especially LGBTQ folks at the time are trying to find sanctuary, I felt like a lot of gay men congregated in the South End for safety. And so the building that I lived in, that I was subleasing at the time, was filled with gay men. Which actually made me feel really safe. My neighbors were awesome. Just, you know, again, being a Black woman and having to walk to and from work and to and from my internship, I felt, you know, a sense of safety and at home and with other marginalized folks. And I agree with you, you know, probably leading into the impacts. And now I could not probably, and I can't actually, I could barely buy an ice cream in the South End. It is very expensive. It is very over the top. People that I know who owned property then and then sold it are like more than wealthy. So yeah, so I'm curious to know what you think the impacts are, Jason.
Yeah, I mean, and I just want to give one other, and Claudia, I know you and I spoke about this yesterday, and you know, I just want to give sort of like my experience on this. And I fully admit that I may not be fully qualified at times to like truly answer the questions, but I just want to give an honest perspective on it. The other way I would define gentrification is you sort of see the Whole Foods and you see the Starbucks and you see sort of like the mom pushing the high-end stroller. And it's like, all of a sudden now it's like an it neighborhood. That's sort of like the beginning is gay man jumps into rehab's house. The back end of that, the impact, Claudia, is that it's borderline unaffordable for like 99.5% of all people. That particular house, I mean, I think he bought it for under $300,000. My guess would be today that's probably worth maybe $4.5 million. I mean, it's been 40 years of time, which, you know, things go up over time generally. So the impacts are that real estate values go up, but that also means that the exclusivity or the ability to even consider being a homeowner gets harder and harder and harder. And so, yeah, so there's both positive and negative impacts on gentrification or from gentrification.
Sure. And Tina just unmuted just in time. I want to hear your thoughts on this, Tina, as well. I mean, I think we have had conversations. Thank you, Jason, so much for that. It was very authentic, you know, to say the least. And it's good to see, because I think it is a perspective that people have that's very different. It's varying. Tina, what are your thoughts?
So for me, growing up, I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. My parents marched with King. Gentrification to me is a dirty word. And it is actually the results of systemic and institutional racism that afford the lifestyle of pushing out the native indigenous people who were in there, devaluing the property so they can get it at $300,000, and then making it a food desert, making it all of the things to then create this quote unquote it neighborhood. So the word gentrification brings a lot of sore feelings towards certain communities and certain individuals who were not afforded the opportunities to stay in their homes and to creating a generational wealth to pass on to other individuals. And now, yes, you do see the high-end strollers and you see the Whole Foods, but you don't see the people who were there who really wanted to make it work, but were not allowed to get loans and were forced out by high insurance premiums. So for me, it is the process of white flight, of steering, of all of the things. Gentrification is the end result of that overall process. So now that it neighborhood was once that thriving community that had their own underground system of payments, and they had the candy lady, and they had the numbers runners, and they had all of those things, and they had their own banking systems, it's now the place where you can get $6 coffee. And so gentrification is, we've kind of forgotten that the foundations and the backbones of those great Victorian buildings and those great, where you walk into a building and you say it has great bones. Well, it is the bones of my ancestors, and it's the bones of the BIPOC community that really you're building upon. And so gentrification, and sometimes the people who are doing the gentrification do not look like the people who started there, which also, has a big problem. We had a huge issue in Detroit, which is going through, I would like to call a revitalization instead of gentrification, where one of our big investors who considers themselves rebuilding Detroit took out a mural that was on the old Hudson's building that did a mural that says, "This is Detroit," right? And it showed the industry, it showed all of that. And there was not a single person of color in the mural. So while we do those things, we must also remember that the systemic and industrial and all of the things that we've lost, that is what gentrification is. So that's my take.
Sure. And I think it's all the things, because we even have in the chat, and we have so many things to talk about, so I want to keep it moving for sure. But Jeff Boucher, I think is his name. I see it as pushing poor people out, which means they have to move further away where they work. Also, it implies that the people who currently live in the neighborhood aren't gentrified, and it's a vile term. Yeah, I think, there is such thing as revitalization here in Boston. We have the Roxbury area, right? Historically Black. It is starting to develop. It's considered lower South End, but it is primarily Black. They've renamed Dudley Square Nubian Square. So they really are trying to keep the same people that were there before there, to build commerce and to stay in the homes that can potentially become the $2, $3, $4, $5 million houses. So I think there's some ways, but I think that is right. I mean, it was very obvious that Tina's triggered, right? Like, I get triggered from hearing that too. I mean, Kevin Hart has that really funny SNL skit of, Bushwick, when I grew up in Brooklyn, like Biggie was in Brooklyn, and now it's like, artisan cheeses and heirloom mushrooms, and like, like it's sort of like the funny, and like the expensive strollers, like Jason said. So that really, we can go down that rabbit hole forever. But you did mention a couple of terms, Tina, and one of them was white flight. And, we're going to, talk about some resources later. Color of Law, if you haven't read it, you must read it. I've read it, listened to it multiple times. They go in depth in white flight in a way that I think that was impactful. Jason, just quickly, and if we could just keep everything until like 90 seconds to 2 minutes. White flight, Jason, I mean, I know you have gone in depth specifically into the Color of Law, but they do talk about this. What are your thoughts about this in white flight? Because I think it does kind of go hand in hand with gentrification, obviously. It's probably like the 2 steps before.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is just how different Detroit compared to Boston would be, even in answering this question. So I mean, I can only speak to what I know with sort of observing Boston and researching it. So you would have had a period sort of like after World War II, 1940s, 1950s, where essentially white people fled the city and then moved to the suburbs. And there were a lot of economic incentives to do that, primarily with VA loans and FHA funding and 0% down. And you ended up creating, I mean, this wall. I mean, there was the wall between the urban center and then the suburbs. And you get deeper and deeper into the book, you start to see that the way urban planning was held and the way that highways were constructed and the way that certain neighborhoods were positioned around industrial zones. It was structurally designed to separate. Boston.
And you're speaking to like the, I remember there was one specific, and this is also, we don't talk about redlining here, but redlining is all throughout this entire conversation of how, you know, I remember the Black, you know, workers at the factory in Newark, New Jersey, right? That's a city that's with public transportation. And then other people, then they kind of force people to go to like Rahway. And then they, you know, so then, but then those neighborhoods are really, the communities are more for white people. So more white people lived in that community. So Black people had to commute and basically spend their paycheck going to and from. They didn't make it feasible. And then the other thing I think about white flight is, yeah, some of those neighborhoods are, the schools are heavily overpopulated. There's not close by, there's no highways, you know, and you were going to say something else, Jason, I'm sorry.
No, it's just specific to Boston. So I would make the argument, or at least the theory that Boston hasn't had white flight, at least in the last 25 to 30 years. Now, I'll go up to the pandemic, which is unrelated and yet related to in a lot of ways. But really, because of the concentration of industry, there was the opposite of white flight. You had everyone clamoring to get in and close to downtown Boston, where the higher paying jobs were. And again, not even touching on inequality there. I'm just saying that like people were really trying to move into the city. And that was observed from like the late 80s, really until the pandemic, when you had sort of a fleeing of the city, but I think that was more pandemic related. So as far as Boston's concerned, it's not a term that is used or thought of. It certainly could exist. I don't see it as much in Boston. I don't know if you've got a similar.
I would agree with you. I think it is more the gentrification. I think it is. I mean, except that I live in Malden. So for people that don't know, I'm 15 minutes from downtown with no traffic from downtown Boston, right? So I'm in the Boston metropolitan area. Bought my house 17 years ago. And I find that a lot of the people, it was very blue collar, and it was definitely more white. And it got more diverse over time. And now I find that it's different. There are still, it's not like it's not white anymore, but I find that some people felt it was getting too cultured. And so they sort of moved closer up north towards New Hampshire. So I think in that perspective, and maybe they couldn't even afford it as well. So I'm not sure, but I find that was what was happening to like my son's classmates and things like that. They were kind of moving further away up to those areas.
Yeah, not to reopen the last question, but it was what are the impacts? And I appreciate so much everything that Tina had said, and I can understand that the word gentrification doesn't land well. I was just trying to answer the question there. But what you've got is you've got an affordability issue in the city of Boston. So, and obviously that can also be unpacked in many ways. But what you see is you see people that are considering different neighborhoods simply based on where can they afford a home. And I think that further sort of like perpetuates what we were talking about with gentrification. Because now, like, for example, your town, Claudia, when you bought in was reasonably priced, right? Like all things being equal, median income, you could buy a house there.
Sure.
Could argue you can't do that today.
No,
right?
no.
It's almost affordable. Right.
That is 100% true. Tina, did you have anything else to add to this before we jump into full-blown discrimination?
No. Other than I know that Jason said something that kind of made me think of something, is that he said, not in the past like 20, 25 years. So the Fair Housing Act is only 55 years old. I'm 52 years old. I will go ahead and date myself. I'm very proud to be 52 years old, but it's only 55 years old that we've actually had the Fair Housing Act itself. So 25 years is really a tear in a salted sea in that time frame of, trying to change a methodology of institutional racism, systematic racism, long-term racism. So we have some work to do, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, for sure. I know that both of you are on the same page with that. That is for
Oh,
sure.
for sure.
Yeah.
But I would also like to give a shout out to our LGBTQ plus community, because marginalized people, we hang together and we stick together, and we can rebuild anything as long as we stick together, for sure. So
yeah, I mean, and then there's the intersectionality, there's the BIPOC queer folks as well. There's all types of stuff, disabled, there's all kinds of things.
Absolutely.
What are some of the ways that we can limit or avoid discrimination? So some of you might have heard about that story. The Black family up in the Bay Area had an appraisal done 1 year, and it was like over $1 million when they appraised it. Then they got some things done to their home, that pretty sweet upgrades, updates to their house. Like I think they added an entire room or a level or something, and it should have been appraised for even higher. The appraiser comes and lowballs it for under, I think it was appraised initially like close to 7 figures or 7 figures, significantly less. And then they had a white couple, friends of theirs that came over and stood in place for the next appraiser, put pictures of the white family, and it went significantly higher. So what do you think there are some ways that we can limit or avoid discrimination during appraisals and the home buying process overall? Tina, I'll start with you.
So I really tell my families when listing to depersonalize their homes as much as possible. And I have them depersonalize their homes even down to items in the refrigerator. It's just because we don't know who is bringing bias and discriminatory practices in their heads when they come into a house to do an appraisal. I usually have my clients not be at home when the appraiser comes, and it's unfortunate in this day and age, but that is the reality. We've seen it time and time again. It's just because it's gotten a lot of airtime, and we have social media and we have the connected world to thank for a lot of things. Before, things were urban legend, and now things are streaming, that you have the ability to see some of these things that happen in real time that are outrageous. So I think just during your overall home buying process, just really be aware that it is out there, and sometimes it's hiding in plain sight.
Sure. Yeah. Jason, do you have anything to add to this? Even specifically, so I think about, so that's optics, right? That's like people, the way they look, but what about people with like ethnic sounding names, right? I know that especially a large Latin and Hispanic populations have had issues, similar discriminatory practices. So do you have anything to add in that sense?
Yeah, sorry, my dog is going nuts right now as the mailman walks by. Interesting, Claudia, at some point I'd love you to send me the story that you referenced with the appraisal in the Bay Area. The one that I'm most familiar with actually happened in Baltimore, and essentially a family was refinancing, and the appraisal came in at like $450,000. And as the story is sort of told, it was obvious, and Tina talked about this, that a Black family lived there. And so they, were suspicious that this was not fair market value, essentially neutralized the home. Tina had referenced this, and then had a second appraisal done, and it came back in at $350,000 higher. So yeah, it's just sort of absurd that that's required. Claudia, we work with a stager. So part of the sort of listing process that I go through is sort of walking through and think aesthetically to start, but we absolutely do have conversations with the seller about everything ranging from crosses on the wall to certain books that are out. Tina, I never thought to even check in the refrigerator. That's super interesting. Family photos, and it's just easier to say, let's make this a showroom that's completely neutral and devoid of any personality at all. And it's a dance, because I think people get offended sometimes. I think they're very proud of their homes, and you've got to walk a fine line there between representing their home in a way that they're proud of, and in the same token, not putting them at a disadvantage.
Right.
So Jason, I have a quick question for you. Average sales price of your homes?
So we are, like I said, we're downtown Boston. So last year would have been just under $1 million. This year, the market, at least from what I'm seeing, is trending at a lower price. So we're seeing a lot of first-time buyers, people jumping from rentals in. So price point this year is down about 750-ish, but think 750 to $1 million.
Average sales price here in my area for a first-time home buyer is about $295,000. We also hold the largest Arabic population outside of the United Arab Emirates. So we have those difficult conversations all the time with our clients, our buyers and our sellers, just because sometimes we do put on a purchase agreement if the last name, they have some reservations about that. We will do initials. We absolutely will. Just because it becomes a big process here of not knowing if you're really getting a fair shake in a multiple offer situation or not.
And I know, I'd love to hear your take on this. And I'm thinking specifically of what in the industry are called love letters. So, you had a very hot market for a period of time here where, a listing would get 50, 100 people through 10, 15 offers. So, you can go big on price and you can be aggressive on the terms. People would start writing or want to write, and a lot of realtors sort of propagated these love letters. I love your house so much, et cetera, et cetera. The first kind of moment for me was actually with two gay clients who were purchasing north of Boston, not far from where Claudia lives, but in a neighborhood where they may not fly, right? Like it may not be accepted by all. And actually, one of the two buyers was like, I don't think we should put this letter together. I think it could work against us. And that was, one of the first time, this is, 4 or 5 years ago, we are like, he's absolutely right. This could cut against him here if the seller is closed-minded. So yeah, it's really cool.
Because of the amount of offers, and we're still in that position here, low inventory, great houses go quick, as I call them, the new hotness, right? A lot of our agents are now requesting no love letters, just because it's just one more slog that they have to go through. So they will put in the listing that there's no love letters. Please don't send any. Yeah. Just so we can look at the raw data, see what's out there. And in that instance, we do have that a lot, especially in some of the communities that it is maybe something to do that. And we do a lot of initials. We do a lot of initials here in Michigan.
Which is unfortunate that people can't just be themselves. And I would imagine it's probably somewhat of a safety issue too, just in general, if someone does get through and then and someone wasn't happy about it in the neighborhood, but majority, everyone would be fine with it, it may still impact them in some way. We talked also a little bit about steering before. For those that don't know, Jason, I'd love you just to share like what is steering. It's pretty self-explanatory, I think, but how can we identify and address steering practices by real estate agents and property owners? So we really kind of touched a little bit on this.
No, we definitely did. And when you say it's an appropriate time, everyone should go and check out a story that was done a few years ago by Newsday. And the title of the story and the documentary is Long Island Divided. And it's sort of, it's tough to believe until you see it. But essentially, say they had 50 to 100 testers, and the testers would go to different real estate offices in Long Island. And the testers ranged from white male to Indian woman. So it was just a very diverse mix of testers. But essentially, the executive summary there is that the properties that were shown and the neighborhoods that were suggested by the realtors varied greatly depending on the person and the color of the person asking to be shown the homes. So steering in and of itself is steering someone towards a neighborhood or potentially steering someone away from a neighborhood. And that gets us into obviously explicit and implicit bias. And that's a whole 5-hour conversation in and of itself. But that's essentially at the root of it, is that the realtor is making suggestions based on their biases about what an appropriate neighborhood would be for a potential customer.
Yeah, no, and it's, thank you, Steve. Steve Tenuzo dropped the link in the chat on that article that Jason was referring to. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely tough. I mean, and Tina, again, I can imagine. I wonder, and I think my parents have mentioned this, right? They own several pieces of real estate at this point, but they have definitely mentioned where someone would make an assumption about them without knowing their pre-approval amount or how much they make, just automatically giving listings in certain areas and regions just based on them being, you know, Caribbean or Latin, you know, without knowing occupation or education background or anything. And that was really hard. You know, it became a little less depending, but definitely my mother has mentioned those situations before. So Tina, have you experienced or seen maybe even fellow colleagues doing it?
It is definitely out there. I'm going to add my 2 cents in there. There's a PBS special called Redlining the Jim Crow laws of the North that talks about that divide. I've only seen it once in real estate. I have done a lot of work with Detroit's local fair housing under the tutelage of John Obie, who has to be one of the greatest national speakers on fair housing. And just some of these stories of the testers that are out there. And the people who you least suspect are testers are usually your testers, and to trip you up and to do that. But I've only seen it happen one time. I am fortunate enough to be married to probably one of the craziest Irishmen this side of the pond. And we see it quite a bit. When we were actually looking at homes, I decided probably the best thing was not to be my own buyer's agent. And so I had another one of my agents be the buyer's agent because, you know, there's just some things that you can do for yourself. And it's like being your own doctor. Let's not do that. And I remember showing up to a house that was an open house. And I knew it was an open house. So the realtor was meeting me there. My husband was there first. So he just stepped into the house and was looking around. And the young lady who was showing the home wanted me to wait outside while she showed my husband the house. And, you know, that didn't go very well, but it was just
probably did not go very well.
Yeah, it actually it didn't go as well, since you know my husband as well, Claudia. It didn't go as well starting there, and then, you know, I tag team in like a WWF, and it just was not the greatest. And then I was a realtor too, so it all did that. So it became quite a thing, and I'm not sure what happened, Mac, but it did not go well because, you know, I full court pressed it. I took it all the way. I was slam dunking it. We were doing all kinds of things for it because it was a horrible experience. And
that's the kind of thing, you know, even if people apologize, it's still harmful. It's still traumatizing to have those experiences happen. And they happen in many facets of our lives, right? And so that's unfortunate. But just so we know, if everyone too, there's a lot of stuff happening in the chat. If you have any questions that you'd want us to share, please put them in the Q&A. We are going to get to those shortly. I wanted to transition into the mortgage crisis. It's actually when I bought my home, around that time. I bought my home in 2006. You know, how did it contribute to the ongoing housing inequality, right? We already know a lot of it has to do back from the redlining and the discriminatory laws that were in place and the practices that still occur. But, you know, specifically the mortgage crisis, the subprime mortgage, the loans that were going out, you know, what lessons were learned? We obviously know a lot of the lessons to prevent similar crises from happening in the future. But that was a major issue. I'm just curious, Tina or Jason.
Can I hop in really quickly? So the foreclosure years were horrible here in Michigan. We had some areas, especially some of the urban areas, where they devalued 50 to 60%. We had also some urban areas that did not devalue at all during that time frame. But I would like to say, for everything that we learned, and I would like to give a lot of credit to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and those folks, that we learned a great lesson about how not to kill our own economy, and two, how not to kill the housing market, and how not to take people out of their homes when they struggle. So during the pandemic, a lot of folks were furloughed, laid off, jobs eliminated. And I want to just say, like, Freddie and Fannie did some amazing things for people during that time frame. I mean, I heard of everything from 40-year mortgages to spending a year's worth of payments on the back end, to really just making sure that people stayed in their homes, to forbearances, to whatever it needed to do to keep people in their homes until they were back and producing and getting that done. So I think that was one of the major lessons, is that these lending institution and investors realized you can't start the foreclosure process. Here in Michigan, we're one of the last states that it takes usually about a year and a half to kick somebody out of their house once a foreclosure process, because we do have 6 months worth of redemption to a year's worth of redemption before you're out of your home. And they did everything to keep them in. But I have to tell you, being in the foreclosure business and doing work with about 22 banks at that time, my highest year, which was 2008, I sold over 1,100 units. I had a staff of 45 at that time. So it was a hot market, but it was not doing anything great for our country. And some areas still have not recovered.
Yeah, definitely. Jason, anything to add to this before we get to our last question?
Yeah, and maybe so I did not personally do a lot. I mean, I got licensed in 2007, started practicing right around then, did a few, but more on the buying side. So this would have been the people that were capitalizing on the pain. What's interesting to me, I mean, the subprime aspect, Claudia, has to be characterized as predatory. I mean, that's exactly what it was. And it was disproportionately targeted towards minorities. And it was just broken on both ends, because you had people that were making money hand over fist, and there was no real due diligence or explanation. So I think that for all the grief we give regulation, things have improved greatly in that respect. These products, some version of them is always out there, just because there's a risk reward with this, but there's way less of it. It's actually much more difficult to qualify for a mortgage now, and there's just a lot more disclosures about the process and the information. I do want to say, though, like when you say, how is it contributing to the ongoing issue? So here's the way I see this, that there's too few homes built in this country right now. And there is a huge shortage in that respect. Following the 08-09 crash, you had large institutional investors, and Tina, I'd love to know if this happened in Detroit or not. I know it happened in other cities. I want you to think hedge funds. I want you to think BlackRock. I want you to think billions of dollars on Wall Street swooped in and purchased thousands upon thousands of single family, primarily housing units, and simply took those out of the mix. So the reality was you had this bubble that caused all of this pain. Prices, to Tina's point, dropped 20, 30, 40, some areas of Florida and Arizona, 80%. And then opportunistic buyers stepped in, primarily these institutional investors, gobbled up the inventory so that today you're like, why is it so expensive to live in certain areas? There's a housing shortage, and then the investors are basically keeping the housing stock and maximizing them as high-end rentals. So the hand of cards has been tipped even further, if that makes sense. So it's only exacerbating the issue with housing today and affordability.
Yeah, no, I would agree. So, I mean, just a little bit of being vulnerable here. I did buy my house in 2006. I did have a subprime mortgage. I believed in the dream. I'm kind of, I'm in sales. I'm a optimist, and I went through a really bad divorce, and I was 100% responsible for myself and my son. And going through that, there was things so predatory to the point of, the realtor was also the mortgage broker, and I didn't know that that wasn't allowed. There was just all kinds of crazy things happening. And, but I got in my house and I'm still here, but my goodness, there's still impacts to this day. So many times of trying to like fight foreclosure and fight, just an immense amount of stress while trying to raise a child. It was a lot. It was a great impact. And I think that is where, we see, and I saw so many people lose their homes. I saw that. I saw people be pushed out of their homes, have to move back in with their parents or family. And it was very challenging. It was very challenging. So I think that, it's still, I don't think it goes away, to your point, Jason. I think there's still, we're going to see the effects of that for probably another great decade or two to come, just because it was so impactful. And of course, I think it impacted the homeless situation in Boston, increased significantly in other major cities as well. I want to move forward with our final one, and then we're going to just talk about some resources. So how can we measure progress towards achieving fair and equitable housing? Right. So like, what would we have arrived to? Like, we're at this place and like, great, we've made massive progress, right? You both have brought up a couple of things that have said, okay, this has been helpful, but what other things do you think that we have achieved? Or how will we be able to measure it, moving forward?
For me, it's always if it has to be the melting pot, right? If your neighborhood looks like you, then your neighborhood's not diverse, and fair housing so far is not working. And I just think that there's a multitude of things, not only affordability, and affordability is two things. It is the market, because we kind of control the market, but it's also manufactured in a lot of ways too as well, right? With things we've created, because the Hamptons, they were very small, they were very different. In fact, one of the biggest things that we have here in our taxing industry that had changed were the DeVosses, where they made special legislation happen to change the terminology and taxing basis of these huge palatial estates that are on these huge swaths of land on lakes here, to not consider them lake mansions, which they are, because I figure if you have over 10 bedrooms, it's a mansion. I'm sorry, I don't care what you call it. But they're cottages. They're considered cottages. So they have a different tax base than, so a person who is in a cottage that's on a small pond in Charlevoix in Michigan is going to pay the same taxes as someone who is in a 10-bedroom because of these changes. So I think that a lot needs to happen in legislation. Biden has some great movement, especially with Marcia Price, who is our 18th Secretary of HUD, who is an African-American woman, Delta Sigma Theta, from Ohio, whose dream of making things affordable and equitable is her commitment to our country when she took over that role. And Biden has 3 by 30 to make sure that in every community, he's putting a minimum of $3 million toward education, toward financing, toward equality, and getting people housing in every community. To do that, there's over $9 billion into that program to make sure that it's out there. And I would tell people to shy away from the rental cycle, because you're always paying someone else's mortgage. If you can pay rent every month and you can do that consistency, work on your credit, because that is the #1 discriminatory tool right now that they have out there against people is credit. And if we don't fix credit, then we can't do all the rest. So get your credit straight, get out there and buy a house and achieve that generational wealth and have something to pass down to your ancestors.
Fantastic. Thank you. Jason, did you have anything else to add to that?
I do, and I just want to pick up on that last that last line that Tina shared. So there's the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco did a study that essentially owning housing going back literally 150 years is the best investment that one could make over time. And the biggest aha that I took away from The Color of Law was that essentially when middle-class wealth was built in the 50s and the 60s, and I'm primarily talking about white middle-class wealth, because a lot of minorities were excluded from even being able to purchase or get financing. And we had alluded to that all the way down to VA and FHA. That was generational compounded wealth as an opportunity cost now. So when you hear things like the average homeowner has a net worth 35 times greater than that of a renter, I think that's where the gap is. And if there were a magical cannon that could fire that single cannonball or bullet to try to like level the playing field, to me it is home ownership. And I think that's what I heard Tina say there. On a local level, because that's grand to say, and I think it should be pursued. Sometimes there's little baby steps that can be made as well. So, having gone through this, Claudia, and the conversations we've had over the last couple of years, NAR, the National Association of Realtors, built out what was called the Fairhaven Simulator. And Tina, I don't know if you've checked this out or not, but it's designed to expose bias. And admittedly, I have not taken this yet. I have not suggested that my team take this yet. I'm a leader in my office. I have not advocated for the office taking this. So I guess just on a very local level, like that's something that can be done tomorrow. And I think if nothing else, it shines a light on everything that we've talked about. And I do have faith in humanity. I would hope that most people, when exposed to the truth and you can tap into something other than their manufactured fear, that they'll choose to do the right thing. And I think that could be a baby step there.
Thank you.
So,
go ahead,
Jason, I'm a big proponent. I'm a G.I. Joe girl, right? So knowing is half the battle. So I think that really the biggest thing is education, and just getting out there and getting your team educated. My team is absolutely sick of me. Being a broker, they get sick of me because I'm like, oh, we're going to this fair housing thing. There's actually a symposium here for Michigan realtors that is on DEI and fair housing, and they have some breakouts and some very One of the breakouts is called The Uncomfortable Truth. And I'm like, yeah, we're all taking this. And they're like, this sounds painful. And I'm like, no, this sounds like people are going to come away from this really open-minded, and there might be a few tears, but you don't know that you're biased until someone says, hey, that's kind of really biased. So because perception is reality. So I would urge you to take it, just because if you don't know, then you don't know. And it'll make it harder for you to make any change. And we need it as a grassroots on, everybody. If we all row the same way, we all get to the same destination.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I was going to say, Jason, I appreciate your honesty. A lot of times people will say, oh, I'm doing everything I can. And I know that you do actively. I've come and done a DEI workshop with your team. I know that you are working on stuff, but to know that you're citing that there is something there that you haven't gotten to yet. That's what I think we need more of, is people just taking accountability and recognizing what is out there. The fact that you even know it, I wonder if everyone else is aware of it, so that was great that you shared that. Thank you. So some resources. Steve already dropped some of the links, luckily, that you had both mentioned. We've talked about The Color of Law a handful of times. I highly recommend this book. It goes way deeper. If you want to sort of nerd out on a lot of the stuff that we mentioned, it goes into all the redlining, what happened post World War II, when folks came home, and how they separated housing, and just how systemic it is, and how much of an issue it is. I think it really is helpful to understand deeper. So especially if you're in the real estate industry, I strongly recommend you read this book. It's powerful for sure. And then there's a couple of others here that we have, so you can take a screenshot, but Evicted, $2 a day. There's some other books. Is there anything else that either of you would like to share? Any other resources?
I'm just throwing it in the chat right now. So Harvard and Suffolk University here in Boston have something called the Harvard Implicit Project that also focuses on bias. That's a really interesting read. And then Claudia, I'm sure you've seen this at some point, but the Boston Foundation did a pretty in-depth investigative story. And the title of the story is "Qualified Renters Need Not Apply." And it just talks about the bias towards Section 8 and subsidized vouchers and what have you. So yeah, these are just resources that I think we have to consume and understand this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for dropping all those. Those are definitely
thank you, Jason. That's awesome. Thank you.
Yes. So for the folks that are here live, you can save the chat. And otherwise, are there any other questions? We are just about out of time. But these are our email addresses, of course. I don't see any questions in the chat, and we are just about up on time. So I just want to say thank you so much, Jason. Thank you, Tina. We are so grateful. We know that none of these conversations are easy conversations, and we thank you for your time, your candor. It was refreshing, and your authenticity. Very helpful. And I know this was a lot of the people that were here were excited. This will be up on our BNI USA YouTube page for those of you that are looking for it afterwards to share, and we ask that you do. And next month, it's Mental Health Awareness Month. So we will have a panel again about that. So we'll have people dealing with various different mental disorders and speaking on mental health. So that's next month, second Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern, May 10th. So definitely be sure to join us. I'm sure that that will be, the link was already dropped by Steve. So make sure that you are checking and pre-registering for that and letting the folks in your chapters know. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our guests, and we will see you next month. Bye-bye, everyone.